Now, this is not a new story. This story has been at least known for 50 years. In fact, the Club of Rome did this report called The Limits to Growth in the early 70s, and the report was totally debunked. I think Ronald Reagan and Thatcher laughed at the report. They say it's completely alarmist. And there was a recent film in which the Club of Rome was interviewed, and they said, now it's too late, because everything they're saying, you can see evidence of that happening. That there's a limit to which you can push a material economy, and there's a limit, and after a while, there's going to be a certain kind of breakdown. The other two books, Sixth Extinction is a relatively recent book, but talks about the era of the Sixth Extinction, written by a journalist, but extremely well researched, and climate change, this is a report which are coming out every day. But what are we proposing for now? We're proposing, firstly, there is nothing called local anymore, because everything local is globally there's an inflection of everything, something global. This particular graph is a graph of something which we are going to use the new generation of mobility with, lithium batteries. This is a graph of lithium movement in the world. The blue dots show where it's available in the world. The orange dots show what are the additional things you need to make lithium batteries, and the products where they're being made. And it's interesting to know that, in fact, there's a report which came out only 3 days back, which talked about that if you convert to electric mobility, the copper used in the electric cars will be 9 times the one used in conventional cars. So, of course, you will, it's an academic report, research which just came out. And so there's where will the copper come from? Where does the lithium come from? Who owns the copper and the lithium? So in the shift towards a new mobility, what is the raw material use of that new mobility? We don't talk about that. We talk about only energy. And that's a problem with the climate change conversations, because we only see things in terms of energy use and fossil fuel use. But there's a whole economy of biodiversity, of people, landscapes, which inhabits this material use. So just carrying on with that, this is a change in the resource use since 1980 to 2013. And you can see there's a rise in that, and I just want to read out something to you to illustrate that. So the Indian Resource Panel group set up by the United Nations Environmental Panel Environment Program to look at resource use to meet what we call Sustainable Development Goals. As you might have heard, there's something called Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals to make everything more sustainable, end poverty, have better health, etc. The International Resource Panel was then commissioned to do a report, see what are the resource needs when you meet those goals. What happens when countries like India and China want to meet those goals of toilets for everybody or for hygiene for everybody? It says global material resource use is expected to reach nearly 19 billion tons in 2017 and may more than double from 2015 to 2050, with high-income countries currently consuming 10 times more per person than low-income countries, and the planetary boundaries being pushed beyond their limit. So that is one side of where all this is going to come from. The other side is who owns these resources. And the report, there's a World Resource Institute report which says that fewer than 10%, in fact, the new Oxfam report which came out at the at Davos, the World Economic Forum, also gave new figures for this, that fewer than 10% of the world's public companies account for more than 80% of all profits, even in newly emerging economies. And 1% of people own over 73% of wealth in India. So this concentration of resource, and I see resource as just nature, as it's all material resource, there's an extensive concentration of where that's happening, and the use is not decreasing. And there is now a claim that we need to decouple growth from resource use. But the with the wrong. Anyway, when you decouple resource use, we find that even in the most advanced economies, where they have far more efficient resource use, that means for the same material you are using it much more efficiently than we are, we have a rise in the amount of materials being used. So decoupling by itself is not reducing the amount of resource use, because the materials are, the economy is becoming in different ways more material dependent. The graph on the left you see is another very interesting graph. It shows the item we always talk about, and Maharashtra has been talking about it, about plastics. This is the current state of production of world plastics. About 355 million tons is what we produce. The extended, by 2050, we'll go to about 1,800 million tons of plastic use. Currently, we're recycling less than 9% of the total plastics. Despite all the systems of recycling and segregation and what we say. And even if you extend a full recycling, almost 40% of the plastics will not be recycled. Nobody wants to turn off the tap. Between now and 2030 or 2040, ExxonMobil and Shell are expected to invest another $180 billion into the plastics industry because of shale oil. So while we are talking of the plastics issue, we're talking of plastics going into the oceans, we are not turning off the tap. We are producing more and more plastic than ever before on the planet. So there's a kind of contradiction in what we are trying to do with economic progress and what we are doing with what happens to the materials which this economic progress is based on. Similarly, this is a graph of the electronic waste use, and this is a graph, you don't have to go to details, of the rare earth metals which are being used in electronics, which are actually scarce. So, and in terms of rare earth metals, there's a direct connection between rare earth metals and who controls them and violence. There is a website called the Electronics Take Back Electronic Take Back. That's called the Electronic Take Back website, and it records the number of violent incidents in the world because of ecological reasons. That means if you have a landscape, if you have a mine, if somebody is protesting, then somebody gets killed for it, or somebody is trying to stop, like in the North Dakota pipeline in the Indian areas in the US. So, and the number of incidents reported from India are the highest. But also that there is the global demand for these rare earth metals will be about $20 billion by 2024. And China has overall dominance of the market. I was just showing the lithium graph, and China now owns almost all the lithium resources in the world. So there's a slow investment into the mines, and also the copper mines. A lot of copper comes from Chile and Peru, and cobalt comes from Congo. So these landscapes where these mines are taking place, which are outside this place where you look at good practices or good mining, etc., these are the places where the real resources are being controlled and being used. One of the reasons why lithium batteries are not being recycled enough is because China artificially keeps the price of raw lithium so low that it's not efficient economically to recycle them. So there's a whole game going on, control of resources, and the resources for the future, besides the game going on data control. And this has become almost like the future Bible. And I've been involved in the circular economy discussions in India. There was an Indian National panel on circular economy. I'm not dismissing the idea of circular economy, that's not required, but it's just not sufficient. And the resources which are available on the planet, if you look at the report of the International Resource Panel, the resources are available where people are living. They are either forests or they're tribal lands. They're not places where you can just go and take them out. So each of them is a site for conflict. And again, we don't think of this, the outcome of all this, outcome of capital is waste. And this is one graph which shows you the complex movement of electronic waste through the world. So both waste and products are a global industry, and resources are a global industry. But the corporations which are controlling these streams are not, they're global corporation in terms of markets, but they're not global corporation in terms of how they're controlled or what standards they need to follow. So a major company can follow a very different standard in Europe and a very different standard in India. And the way it operates in these two places can be very different. I can give you tens of examples of this, but I don't want to go down that path right now. A lot of the waste lands up in places like this. So where who pays for the waste being deposited? These are externalized costs. Nature is an externalized cost. Human health is an externalized cost. So this cost is never put into the main cost of the products we use. Now I want to just touch on two things on how nature starts appearing differently from how you inhabit it. And the fact that we think nature as one category which can be mobilized and thought of as one conceptual framework is actually not so. There are actually a lot of new writings in the last 20, 25 years on gender and relationship to ecology and environment. But the new writings now also from the relationship between caste and nature, the caste and the green. Mukul Sharma, who's written extensively on caste and green, talks about this. And he says that if you're able to locate Indian environmental politics through the eyes and actions of Dalits and the various movements in different parts of the country, we may be able to glean a new ecological universe, a visible Dalit environmental public space, which is often outside the dominant discursive frame, but is nonetheless embedded in Dalit ecological understandings. So this is a completely rather unexplored area. A lot of work has been done in the US when you look at environmental justice issues. For example, the communities of color have always talked that all the incinerator and the waste sightings are done where they live. And there's a racial component to how waste is dealt with in the US. But this idea of caste being a way in which nature appears different is relatively unexplored. In fact, the new writings are still coming out. And we need to consider that the idea of nature changes on your location in the social hierarchy. So who you are. And in the case of gender, these fractures run deeper since they cut across social hierarchies. The feminist economist Ravi Agarwal writes that women, especially those in poor rural households in India, are victims of environmental degradation in quite gender-specific ways, and that women's and men's relationship with nature needs to be understood as rooted in the material reality, in the specific forms of interaction with the environment. And it is not just by chance that the Chipko movement was led by women. Of course, there are different claims to what guided that movement, but also that the women had to fetch firewood, and they knew they were dependent on water for the forest around them. And if you cut the forest, then they have to walk long distances, and they lose their everyday sustenance. So both material dependencies, which are very crucial, and their related mythological and cultural dependencies or cultural inhabitations are deeply embedded in how people live with landscapes. There is also how the marginalized artisans, small farmers, small fishermen are being excluded from these, what's happening around them. This is a picture from a marginal fisherman, a small artisanal fisherman, who paddle boats every morning to fish in the south of India, using an ancient boat, the Katamaran, and comes back with hardly any catch, precisely because he does not know what's happening around him. He does not know why the fish are disappearing, does not know why the beach is disappearing. He does not know how the pot made in the upstream of his beach, how that's changing the sand flow. He's not aware of that. In a sense, he's lost all agency to know what's happening, except resign himself to his fate. And this is not an isolated thing. P. Sainath, the journalist and social activist, writes, the total number of farmer suicides in the country since 1995 crossed 300,000 mark in 2014. The current crisis is not just a crisis of water, electricity, land, but a measure of the loss of humanity. Landless agricultural laborers migrate to urban centers to find jobs as agriculture becomes less remunerative. Artisans involved in crafts have no takers for their products as cheaper factory goods flood the market. Rural communities are in distress as they're increasingly displaced by industrial projects. And unquote. And yet, they have no single apparent adversary to protest against. You know, it's easy to protest against a big project, easy to protest against a port, easier. But how do you protest against a whole condition change? And if everything is changing around them for no single identifiable reason, an omnipresent but slow, invisible slow violence, normalized as it creeps in like a ghost, set loose by unidentified perpetuators, which takes away their agency of resistance. The disenfranchisement could not be more complete, nor democracy seem more illusionary. And this is how people really on the ground feel. In this whole debate of normalizing nature, we also lose the cultural way, the deeply cultural ways in which we have lived on the planet. This is a very interesting book I want to point you to. Radhika Govindarajan. It's just come out, and it's a fascinating read. She's an anthropologist. She's done extensive work in the lower Himalayas, looking at how people live with animals, and what is the idea of animal sacrifice. And it's completely fascinating. When you read it, we go out of this binary of, you know, animal sacrifice and no animal sacrifice and animal. You go out into the lived idea of how people bring animals into the life as their own family. So these are ideas which we seem to have not been in the public discourse and in the way we think about what we need to do. Again, access to technology, even low-end technology is a big problem. So though we say we have technology for, you know, better fishing, or you might have solar-powered engines these are not solar-powered, but solar-powered engines. The point is that who can access that? Because once you put that, you need a larger boat, you need larger nets, you need a whole different economic system to sustain a boat powered by an engine. So the idea and context of the fishermen changes, and those people who cannot participate in that economy are completely left out. So in a sense that anything which becomes commodified, devalued, except for its monetary value, and when things are not valued, they disappear because they slowly phase out. We don't see extinctions very quickly, but something just doesn't appear anymore. And they're not dramatic moments, they're just moments which happen over a period of time. And this loss of an expansive value of nature as reduced to an economic one has caused local ecosystems like riverine tracts, wetlands, coastal regions to be degraded or destroyed, as they're hard to translate into economic value. And this wetland, if you just take the question of wetlands, because wetland is the no man's land, it's the no water, no land, or water and land area between a river and land. We have till recently no policy to deal with wetlands. What exactly, do we drain them? Do we leave them? Do we build on them? That they have some function to perform. It's the interstices, and these interstices are lost because of the lack of what we know about how ecosystems really are.